Today's video is about the disappearance and murder of Abigail Williams and Liberty German. The two teenagers were surprised and killed by a man just as they were about to take photos and videos for Snapchat. The bizarre thing about it is that the girls could have helped solve their own murder by perhaps taking pictures of the perpetrator. But whether these pictures really helped solve the case is something you'll learn about in today's video. Today's case took place in February 2017. 13-year-old Abigail Williams and 14-year-old Liberty German were best friends. They went to school together, were in the school band together, and played volleyball and softball together. They also spent almost every minute of their free time together and loved being outdoors. They rode bikes or went hiking. Liberty, or Libby, as her friends called her, was the more outgoing of the two. She loved all kinds of sports. Her friends described her as very open and extroverted. Whenever someone was treated unfairly, she intervened and stood up for those who were being treated unfairly, no matter whether she knew the person or not. She was a role model when it came to civil courage. Abigail, on the other hand, was a bit more shy. The 13-year-old was a rather quiet and reserved child, but perhaps that's why the two of them complemented each other so well. One thing is for sure, the girls were inseparable, and sadly, the way Libby and Abby spent their lives together, they were also destined to meet their deaths together. Particularly in the last 10 years, interest in social media has increased rapidly. Perhaps you know this from yourself. You spend far too much time on your cell phone and follow the lives of other people on platforms like Instagram, Snapchat, or Twitter. Frequent use of social media is often demonized, but it cannot be denied that younger people in particular derive great joy from this self-representation, and that you can also capture beautiful moments. And just like teenagers do, Abby and Libby regularly shared their lives and their friendship on social media. Although this fact has brought us a great deal closer to solving today's case, the Snapchat app should initially cost the two girls their lives. It was Monday, February 13th, 2017. Due to a holiday, Abby and Libby did not have to go to school that day. Abby had spent the night at Libby's house. Libby and her sister lived with their grandmother. The girls had a great time. They had a movie night with Libby's older sister Kelsey, talked, and did a little painting. Still, they went to bed early because they had big plans for the night of February 13th. Abby and Libby wanted to go hiking. The girls lived in Delphi, a small community in Indiana. It was a beautiful rural area, and most of Delphi's nearly 3,000 residents knew and liked each other. The two had planned to go for a walk along Deer Creek, a river that ran through Delphi because a real attraction was hidden in the middle of the forest, the Monon High Bridge. It is an old railroad bridge. Trains haven't run over it for a long time, but the historic railway line has been preserved and is now a popular destination for hikers and walkers. At the spot the girls were heading for, the railroad track ran directly over Deer Creek. There is a fantastic view over the river and the trees. It is an idyllic place and the perfect spot to take a few photos for social media. After lunch, 16-year-old Kelsey drove the girls to a parking lot near the bridge. Libby's father and her grandmother were initially hesitant to drop the teenagers off there alone, but they were persuaded. After all, the route was a popular excursion destination, and both girls had their cell phones with them. At around 1:30 p.m., Kelsey dropped them off at the nearby parking lot. Libby and Abby were happy. The sun was shining, and it was extremely warm for mid-February. They agreed with Kelsey that Derek, Libby's father, would pick up the girls at 3:15 p.m. at the same parking lot. Then they said goodbye and went on the signposted hiking trail. Kelsey waited until she saw them disappear into the forest and then drove back home. It would be the last time the sisters saw the girls alive. Abigail and Liberty followed the trail through the forest. There were hardly any leaves on the trees yet, but the sunshine and blue sky made it feel more like a warm spring day. From the parking lot, it took about 15 minutes to reach the Monon High Bridge. The bridge was not actually part of the trail because it could be dangerous to cross it. Most people, however, were not deterred. Soon after, Abby and Libby arrived at the Monon High Bridge. The long wooden bridge was a bit shaky when you walked over the individual planks, but it made a very impressive picture. To the left and right of the narrow crossing, the ground dropped steeply down to the water for several meters. But that didn't deter the girls, so they crossed the bridge, taking a few photos along the way. At 2:07 p.m., Libby posted a picture to her Snapchat story, a feature that allowed Libby's friends to view the image before it deleted itself after 24 hours. In this picture, you could see Abby walking across the bridge. It was the last sign of life from the two girls. Libby's family took a screenshot of the image, and it ended up in the public domain, which is why it later became very well known. It is also the reason why the case was nicknamed the Snapchat murders. If you look at the picture knowing that the two were brutally murdered only a short time later, it leaves a really depressing feeling. But what was later found on the girls' cell phones was even creepier. Derek, Libby's father, set off a little later to pick up the girls. At 3:11 p.m., on his way to the parking lot, he called his daughter to let her know that he would be arriving shortly and that they should set off on their way back if they had not already done so. But Libby did not answer the phone. Instead, the dial tone was eventually replaced by the answering machine. Libby's father left a short message and hung up. Only about 5 minutes later, Derek reached the agreed meeting point at the parking lot. However, there was no sign of the girls. He then tried to call his daughter again without success. Libby's father assumed that the girls had lost track of time and that their cell phone batteries might be dead. Since the bridge wasn't too far away, he decided to go and look for the two teenagers himself. He walked the trail to the bridge and back for 30 minutes without finding any sign of the girls. When he returned to the parking lot, he called Libby's grandmother. At first, he thought it was a misunderstanding and that the girls had perhaps already been picked up. But this was not the case. The family then suspected that the two had gotten lost, so they mobilized friends and family members who then searched the forest together with Libby's father. They also informed Abby's mother, who immediately became very worried about her only child. Word of the missing girls quickly spread in the small town of Delphi, and so some volunteers joined the search for the girls. In total, there were almost 100 people. Together, they combed the surrounding area for an hour and a half, looking in vain for the teenagers. At around 5:30 p.m., they decided to alert the police. However, the search was postponed until the next day due to the onset of darkness. Only a few family members, including Libby's father and grandfather, and some of the volunteers continued the search for the missing girls during the night. Nevertheless, the family's concern was relatively low. They and the police were sure they would find Libby and Abby alive the next day. Libby's sister Kelsey later said that she had never expected a crime in a peaceful small town like Delphi. Everyone searching for the girls assumed that Abby and Libby had simply gotten lost and that the batteries in their cell phones had died. The girls' family had even packed warm blankets and granola bars so that the teenagers could get immediate sustenance after spending a night outside in the cold. So the hope was still great. Together with many volunteers and some tracking dogs, the police searched the forest on the morning of February 14th. The search remained unsuccessful for some time until one of the volunteers found a black athletic shoe. He took it to Kelsey, who confirmed that the sneaker belonged to her sister. Now everyone was very worried. They sensed that something bad must have happened. Hope was shattered. Around noon, one of the volunteers noticed two deer sniffing the ground in a conspicuous spot. It was a somewhat remote hill that they had not yet looked at more closely. The investigators went to the hill and found the bodies of the two girls there, about a kilometer from the railroad bridge. It quickly became clear that they had been murdered. The volunteers were in a state of shock. None of the residents of Delphi would have expected such a brutal crime to occur in their town. Fear and panic spread among the citizens when it was announced that the two teenagers had been murdered. The once popular destination was now deserted. None of the inhabitants dared to go into the forest, let alone to the Monon High Bridge. The fear that the culprit would strike again was too great. The autopsy reports on the bodies of Abigail and Liberty have been kept secret. The cause of death of the girls is still kept under lock and key to this day, probably for investigative reasons. Allegedly, however, the girls' underwear was found under the bridge, which would indicate a sexually motivated act. Of course, in the age of the internet, in recent years some anonymous users have come forward who allegedly participated as volunteers in the search for the girls and therefore think they know the cause of death. Often one reads that the girls are said to have had no external injuries and that no specific weapon could be determined as the object of the crime. Another user, on the other hand, says that the girls' bodies showed multiple stab wounds and that the perpetrator slit their throats. It is also not known whether the girls were abused before their death. However, there are some indications that they were. For one thing, the girls' underwear was found at the bridge. And, on the other hand, some registered sex offenders were questioned about the incident. The police had identified the first suspect on the day the bodies were found: Ron Logan. The man owned the land where the girls' bodies were found, and Ron already had a criminal record. In the past, he had often been found driving under the influence of alcohol. However, Ron Logan was able to provide a solid alibi for the time of the crime, and so the investigation against him was quickly dropped. Soon, however, investigators made a shocking discovery on Libby's cell phone, which was found near her body. In addition to the photo and Libby's Snapchat story, they found several other photos and videos on the smartphone. Some of them have since been released by the police, but much of it remains classified and not available to the public. Similar to most of you, Abby and Libby were also big true crime fans. They later wanted to become forensic doctors or work in law enforcement. Therefore, it is assumed that the girls made the recordings consciously in case the conspicuous man wanted to harm them. Brave and sharp-witted are often attributes that were mentioned in the same breath as the two girls. In one video, they can be heard talking about noticing a creepy man at the bridge. They joke about it, saying that it was probably a murderer and that they should film him. The girls felt that he was following them, and they unobtrusively recorded the man as he approached them. It is not known how long the video is in total, as the police have only released parts of it. More specifically, just a picture and a short video recording. It shows a tall man wearing jeans and a blue jacket. He's walking with his hands in his pockets over the railroad bridge and appears relatively safe, although the narrow bridge is shaky and rotten. With the help of a witness who was hiking the same route and claims to have seen the man, a sketch was created. At first, it was said that the police only wanted to talk to the man and thought he was a witness. A short time later, this was corrected, and so it was said that the man was in all likelihood the murderer. It can be assumed that the police proceeded tactically here and initially wanted to lull the man into a sense of security in the hope that he might report to the police. In general, the investigators proceeded with extreme caution and in a structured manner in order to convict the culprit. A little later, they also released an audio recording from Libby's cell phone with the voice of the man from the video recordings. You can hear him saying, "Guys, down the hill." And here is the recording.
Guys, down the hill. Guys, down the hill. Guys, down the hill.
According to the police, this is an order directly to Abby and Libby. What is particularly striking to me is how calmly the man speaks. He doesn't order it out loud, but says it so calmly, as if in a normal conversation, but also firmly. It is also unclear whether he threatens Abby and Libby with his weapon. I assume that he must have intimidated them with something. Otherwise, the girls would probably just have run away instead of obeying his orders. Unfortunately, the sound recording is of a slightly inferior quality. This is probably because Libby put her cell phone in her jacket pocket and kept the audio recording running inconspicuously. Once again, she acted very cleverly, probably influenced by the various true crime formats she had already heard. It is also not known how long the original recording is, so there is a possibility that the recording was still running while the girls were being murdered. It should also be mentioned that the girls' bodies were found on the other side of the river, not on the side where you recorded the videos and filmed the man. Since parts of the recording are only available to the police, one can only speculate as to how this could have happened. Perhaps the girls tried to escape over the bridge and he followed them. Alternatively, the perpetrator may have crossed the river with them, as it was not particularly deep. Or perhaps the girls fled across the river when they were down by the hill, but were then caught up with by the perpetrator again. But you also have to consider that the area was very popular with hikers, and no one saw the girls with the man that day. The area around the freestanding bridge and the river below was very visible. If they had been there for a longer period of time, it would have certainly been noticed by a passerby. But at the same time, this also means that the perpetrator probably knew the area very well. A few months later, a witness came forward who had been hiking the same route as the girls on the day of the murder. He said that he had seen the man, and on the basis of his statement, the perpetrator's sketch was completely revised. In the new sketch, the man now looks significantly younger, and the shape of his face has changed completely. Now the perpetrator is estimated to be between 18 and 40 years old. Since the sketches differ so greatly from one another, the police investigated in a different direction for the first few months and suspected men who are no longer a possibility. However, the question also arises as to why the witness only reported to the police so much later and whether his testimony can be believed. The police probably looked into these questions in great detail because they would certainly not have carelessly exchanged the complete sketch while they otherwise proceeded so deliberately. The police in Depli were hoping very much for the help of the population. That was also the reason why they did not publish some recordings from Libby's cell phone. If it comes to a court case at some point, they would still have knowledge of the perpetrator in their hands. This in turn means that they do not want to publish everything, since the videos contain information that only the perpetrator can know and that they may be able to convict him of during an interrogation. However, it could also be a bluff by the police to unsettle and pressure the culprit. Since he apparently hadn't realized that he was being filmed, he probably doesn't know himself how much of him could actually be seen and heard. Otherwise, he would surely have disposed of or destroyed the cell phone. Or it is part of a sick fantasy that he is still at large and God knows what he is doing, even though recordings of him are in circulation. Nevertheless, it would certainly be advantageous to publish even more of the recordings. If the culprit comes from Delphi, a small town where almost everyone knows everyone, further video or audio recordings could be the missing piece of the puzzle to recognize the man. Numerous tips were received regarding the case, but none of them turned out to be particularly useful. The perpetrator's DNA was also found at the scene, but no matches were found in the Indiana database. Since January 2018, DNA samples have been taken from all offenders in Indiana and registered. However, the DNA of the murderer of Abigail and Liberty was not yet included. In September 2017, the police arrested Daniel J. Nations, a convicted sex offender who looked very much like the sketch. In the past few weeks, Daniel had also repeatedly threatened people out walking on hiking trails with an axe. All of this makes him very suspicious. However, Daniel Nations was able to provide an alibi for the murder of Abby and Libby. He was convicted of threatening the hikers, however, and was given 3 years probation. Since then, there has been very little progress in the case of Abigail Williams and Liberty German. On July 28, 2019, the police wanted to arrest the criminal Paul Etter. He raped a woman on June 22nd and has been wanted ever since. He also closely resembled the sketch, but before he could be arrested, Paul Etter killed himself. Whether he had anything to do with the Delphi murders remains unclear to this day. Delphi police officers gave several press conferences in which they said that they thought the culprit would probably come from Delphi or the immediate vicinity. They even addressed him directly. They are sure that they have spoken to him before or even interrogated him. After that, they appealed to the residents. Someone would surely know the man and cover for him because he is a friend or family member. They asked for the help of the public because they only needed one more piece of the puzzle to finally solve the case. They also assumed that the murderer had not killed for the first time, as he had proceeded so calmly and purposefully. However, one must also assume that it was not the last time either. The photos and videos on Libby's cell phone have made this murder case very well known and have sparked the interest of many amateur detectives on the internet because headlines like Snapchat killer encourage clicking. As with this video here too. I would now like to look at the most likely theories that have emerged and that are particularly popular. Initially, the question was often discussed as to whether the crime was planned or happened by chance. How was the man supposed to know that Abby and Libby would be on the bridge that day? If he had planned the crime, he may have had to follow the girls from the parking lot. But then more witnesses would have seen him for sure, and the girls, who spent some time at the bridge, would probably have noticed him sooner. But the perpetrator couldn't just have been hanging around the bridge waiting for a suitable victim, because he would certainly have been noticed by more people there as well. There is at least some evidence to suggest that the man knew the area well. He knew how to guide the girls out of sight of passing pedestrians and disappeared unseen after the attack. This also suggests the theory that he did not stop in the parking lot where Abby and Libby were dropped off. It was very busy, and he could easily have been seen. But there was a second possibility. On the other side of the bridge, near the edge of the forest, was a cemetery with another parking lot. This place was secluded, so if he came by car, the man probably parked there. From there, a road also led quickly out of town. So if he came from further away, he could have driven back unnoticed from there. However, the fact that the perpetrator had a very good knowledge of the area and had probably been to the bridge or the forest many times before speaks against the fact that he came from further away. Because, as already mentioned, it seemed as if he knew how to lead the girls past the often visited paths without being noticed and knew a place where he could kill them without being discovered. Then there is the question of whether this is a repeat offender. The man's walk and the way he says, "Guys, down the hill," are both very calm and relaxed. If this were the man's first crime, one might assume that he would have been much more agitated and could at least hear it in his voice. So let's assume that there were already victims before Abby and Libby. At least in Indiana, he has never been convicted. This means that he either came from another state after all and may have a criminal record there, or that he has not yet been prosecuted for any of his crimes, which, at least in my opinion, would be the clearly more disturbing alternative. Another mystery is whether the man was armed. No weapon can be seen in the recordings that have been released, but I wonder whether an authoritarian manner would be enough to intimidate two girls who seem very bright. He probably did not inspire trust. Otherwise, Libby and Abby would not have taken photos of the man and would not have described him as creepy. Nevertheless, it cannot be ruled out entirely. Maybe she only felt threatened at first, but when he got closer, they pushed the fear aside. And that brings us to the individual theories. As mentioned at the beginning, Libby and Abby were very active on social media. It is possible that one of them had met a boy online and wanted to meet up with him. However, they knew that their parents would never allow it, so they came up with the pretext of going hiking. Although they actually arranged to meet their internet acquaintance at the railroad bridge. Because she didn't want to go alone, her best friend accompanied her. But the supposed young man was not a young man at all, but only pretended to be one on the internet to get close to young girls. And in fact, the police even suspected one of Libby's Facebook friends for a while. However, the middle-aged man had an alibi. Another much-discussed theory is that the sheriff from Delphi, Toby Lee Senby, is the culprit they are looking for. The policeman bears a strong resemblance to the first sketch, and his calm voice, which can be heard in various interviews, could also match the sound recordings. The reason why he is suspected by many is an emotional press conference at which police officer Doug Carter addresses the culprit personally. He appeals once again to the public and says very emphatically that not much is missing to solve the case. He says that he is sure that the culprit comes from Delphi, that they may have spoken to him before, or that the culprit is even in the room today. Toby Lee Senby stands behind Carter during the press conference. A great many people find his behavior strange during his colleague's speech. Toby turns red and his eyes rest uneasily around the room and on the floor. At this point, however, I have to mention that this is all just speculation and that a lot can be read into the policeman's behavior. There is no specific evidence that Toby D. Lee Senby is really the culprit. However, he himself says elsewhere that a great many people were suspected in the course of the investigation and that he himself was also considered a suspect. But surely the suspicion would have been dropped if there was evidence that he had something to do with the crime. It stands to reason that his DNA was compared with that of the culprit and that it did not match. But if Toby Lee Senby or another police officer had waylaid the girls, it would explain some points in the case. The man could have identified himself and openly carried a weapon without being immediately seen as a threat. This could also explain why the perpetrator calmly orders the girls to go down the hill. A police officer would inspire confidence and might tell the girls a story about why they were not allowed to be at the bridge and should follow him. The two teenagers would certainly have done that without resisting. The man could have easily taken advantage of their trust. If you follow this theory further, there is of course also the possibility that the police officer manipulated evidence, possibly even the DNA found at the scene. This could also explain why the sketch was completely redone months later. The profile of the perpetrator is now quite different, and so the police officer could have deflected suspicion even further from himself. But these are just speculations. Another theory is that the man in the video is not the perpetrator, but only wanted to help. Maybe he could already see the real culprit and wanted to save the girls by guiding them down the hill without attracting attention. This would also be a possible explanation for why the voice on the recordings is so calm and collected, because it was not an order, but an invitation to protect the girls. Maybe the girls didn't listen to him, got scared, or maybe even just ran away and thus directly into the arms of the actual perpetrator. When the man then learned from the news that the girls had been murdered and that he was the prime suspect, he became frightened. That's why he never dared to testify to the police. Maybe he had an alibi for the time of the crime, which was a little later than the video recordings, and his DNA doesn't match that of the perpetrator. So he may have already been interrogated, but not further suspected. How likely do you think this theory is? I think that the police would not have released the recordings carelessly with the hint that the man is the perpetrator if they were not sure about it. Presumably, there are also other unknown recordings that clearly show that the man on the recordings committed the murders. But I still find this theory interesting because it sheds a completely new light on the case. At the end of April 2022, the police announced that they suspect James Chadwell of having committed the murder. The 42-year-old was arrested on April 19, 2021. A 9-year-old girl had disappeared in his neighborhood that day. Police searched his house and found the girl naked and crying in Chadwell's locked basement. He had undressed her and choked her until she lost consciousness. He had probably ordered the dogs to attack the girl. James Chadwell had a long criminal record dating back to 2000. He had already committed several acts of aggravated assault, possessed a weapon that he was not allowed to have, and was also in possession of some stolen property. When he abducted the girl, Chadwell was on probation. If you look at a photo of him, you can clearly see the similarities to both identikit pictures of the Delphi killer. What's more, the 42-year-old is also from Indiana. The tattoo on Chadwell's arm is absolutely shocking. It shows two disfigured girls bleeding from their eyes and noses. If you compare the tattoo with photos of Abby and Libby, you might think that he has tattooed their faces. The shape of the head and some features in particular suggest that it is indeed them. Of course, it is not enough to arrest him and link him to the case of Abby and Libby. Maybe he just has them to shock. Still, it's more than strange. Chadwell's brother also later testified that he was not aware of the tattoo and that it must have been done in the last few years. Furthermore, Chadwell had already attracted attention in the past because he was active on platforms like Facebook and TikTok and made derogatory comments against women there. His own brother said in an interview, "He's a monster, an absolutely evil person. Do I think he's capable of the crime against the girl? Absolutely." He also said that Chadwell had tried to drown him when they were children. Chadwell's stepfather was also asked whether he would have committed such a crime, to which he replied, "Is he capable of it? Possibly. Should he ever be allowed out on the street again? Never. This time, the key to his cell should be thrown away." But this lead also eventually came to nothing. The latest suspect is Richard Allen. Allen has since been charged as many pieces of evidence point to him as the potential murderer of the girls. However, his trial has been postponed several times and is now scheduled to start in October 2024. Perhaps then we will learn what really happened to the girls, and the parents can finally find peace. And that brings us to the end of today's video. The case of Abigail Williams and Liberty German remains unsolved to this day. You can still find numerous candles and flowers at the Monon High Bridge, commemorating the brutal crime that took place here. It's not just the people of Delphi who can't get this crime out of their heads. It is also one of the most well-known crimes of recent years. It is hard to imagine the incredible fear the girls must have felt in their last few minutes, and despite their courage and ingenuity, which they managed to film and record, he has not been caught to this day. All that remains are the videos and numerous speculations about how the crime was committed. But I want to believe the sentence of the policeman who says that the investigators are only one piece of the puzzle away from solving the case. The hope remains that this case will not go down in history as a cold case, but will be resolved in the coming months. Especially for the courageous girls and their grieving families, this would certainly be important in order to find peace. If you liked the video, please leave a like, comment, and/or subscribe. With just 2 clicks and a few keyboard strokes, you can support the channel enormously. Thanks in advance, and thanks for watching. Good night and see you.